This is Pod Strangely Warmed, a place where we tell the good Methodist story, where we have conversations that invite followers of Jesus to seek after that loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all, and have a little fun along the way. Welcome back to Pod Strangely Warmed. I'm Daniel Hawkins, your host, and as we begin this Lenten journey, it's my joy to celebrate with you and remind you that we, as the Central Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, have embraced a new vision for ministry, to be followers of Jesus Christ, seeking after the loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all. As we go into this Lenten journey, I am joined on the podcast for this season by Reverend Erin Sloan Jackson, who you have done an amazing thing. You have written a book.
I did. When I first heard the vision statement for our conference and the North Texas Conference, I realized there was a lot of content in that one sentence and wanted to be able to unpack it and really internalize the message. So I wrote a 6-week Wesleyan study based on that vision statement. Perfect for Lent, but something that people can use at any time.
And over the next 3 weeks on the podcast, we will explore what it means to live into the loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all. We hope you'll stick with us. Today, we are excited on the podcast, as you just heard, to begin our exploration of this being followers of Jesus Christ, seeking after the loving, just, and free world that God imagines for all people. To help us in the season, we've got Erin Sloan Jackson, who you already met and who wrote the book on this thing. And so we're so excited that you are here. Also, Reverend Joy Dister-Dominguez here today as we unpack what does it mean to be loving. But before we get to that, love is in the air in this time of year and in this time of our experience, both in the church and in the pop culture. I'd wonder, actually, we haven't had a chance, Erin, to hear why this book? Why now, right? What pushed you to this? Because we often hear incredible words of wisdom from our bishop and from our cabinet that invite us into new ways of thinking, but I'll confess, I've never written a book in response to one, right? And so why writing the book, Loving, Just, and Free, a 6-week Wesleyan Bible study that is a #1 new release in some obscure Amazon sub-context.
Yes, for 1 week it was.
From one pseudo-author to another, well done.
Thank you.
So what's the origin story behind this? What pushed you and inspired you to say, I want to invest, because this doesn't just appear, right?
Right.
There's heart, there's energy, there's effort, there's work in this.
Right. And so last time we met, we had a little podcast recording. And then right after that, I went to go meet with my district superintendent. And he asked that same question, like, with great enthusiasm, what do you think of this new vision statement? And I had to confess, like, I am like the Gen X of Gen Xers. And so what I mean by that is, I was like Chandler Bing's character on Friends. Like, I'm naturally a cynical that's my reaction to things. And so I started in ministry about 22 years ago when purpose-driven church was the big thing with Rick Warren. And so I was like, oh, okay, so this is what we're going to do. It's going to be these 5 things, and we're going to focus on that. But then like a few years later, then it was like simple. I might get the order out of order, but it's like, then we had the simple rules that we had to follow. Or, okay, this is our new direction. And then there's fruitful congregations. And so it got to this point where it's like, okay, it's just like one buzzword followed by another buzzword, followed by another buzzword, all trying to just simplify the complexity of discipleship. And I couldn't help but feel really cynical. I even, as a writer for the youth worker movement, wrote an article called "How to Have Buzzword-Free Youth Ministry." So I'm kind of anti the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And so when this was brought up, presented to us as leaders in the conference as the new vision statement, my gut reaction was cynicism and So when I met with the district superintendent, I confessed all of these things, not knowing that he helped write it.
Yeah, he wrote it. Yeah,
and he was very enthusiastic. And so, maybe put my foot in my mouth a little. But it did cause me to realize that if this is the new vision, is this the way we're going to go?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot in that one statement.
Yeah.
And so it's worthy of unpacking. And it was actually at a core leadership meeting where the same superintendent made the comment, like, we should have studies on this. And I thought, that's a great idea. And I needed one for my own context. So I put a book together, and hopefully it's a resource other people can use.
Yeah.
But just really unpacking each little component of that vision statement and getting some discussion around it, so it can be one of those things that we can really hang our hat on and fully understand.
That I love, and thank you for your moment of confession at the beginning, right? That inherent kind of cynicism of Gen X. Joy and I are children of the same year, which means we are geriatric millennials or super young Gen Xers, depending on the moment. And
Sure.
we get to embody both vibes, right? Depending on the spirit. And so that cynicism can be a real thing. And it's a real response, and often to an institution coming out with another thing, right? Here's another set of. I remember when Bishop Snazy, he had the 5 fruitful practices, which were really formational to churches, but then he came out with the 7 levers like 3 years later, and I'm like, I'm not even reading this book. Sorry, Bishop Snazy, but because of that same kind of inner, impulse.
I just got my arms, I just got my head around this one thing.
Right.
Why are we going a different direction now? Yeah.
Well,
or
and
saying the same thing in different ways.
And often, the churches we serve are not the most agile, right? And so it took us a decade to learn the 5 fruitful practices. And so to 3 years into it, flip the language again sometimes feels a little hard. When I was talking to Philip about this, because we had a very similar conversation as he was rolling it out to begin with, and very kind of excited. Philip's a bit of a cynical Brit too, right? And so to see him kind of bubbling about it really meant, okay, he's into this, and this means something powerful. The thing that captured me was so often these purpose-driven churches, all of the buzzword kind of focus things describe what we're going to do, but never give us a vision of what the outcome's going to be. And I loved that we do have 5, key focus areas coming out of this, right, as an annual conference. But we began with the dream of what the future might be, right? This statement, being followers of Jesus, seeking after the loving, just, and free world that God imagines for all people. That's a vision that got me excited, right? And so it overcame my inner cynicism too, not because it was like, what would that world look like, right? Can you imagine the truly loving, just, and free world that God imagines for all people? Not that we kind of put an artificial limitation on, right? We say, well, what's possible, right? We can limit that. But what would it be if God could just completely imagine a new world for every person who is suffering, for every person who is not thriving, for every person who is struggling in one way or another, right? In John, Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. And he's not just talking about heaven, right? He's talking about this world here today. Thank you, Erin, for writing the book. Thank you, Joy, for being here with us. Today, I'm hoping we can begin to unpack a little bit of what that loving part of that loving, just, and free world God imagines for all people, what that might look like, and where that meets us in our individual walks day by day, but also in the lives of our communities of faith, right? Where does this loving world come into being? And as we get started, I think it's important just to name that, the English language is inherently limited, right? We're going to talk about loving, Valentine's Day is tomorrow, so is Ash Wednesday, right? And so we have this conflagration of demonstrations of what love looks like. Love is also the world where, like, if you ask my 3-year-old what she loves, she's going to love Bluey and cheese and mommy and daddy and God and and it takes very different expressions of what love is. And so hopefully we can spend a little time unpacking a bit of what that looks like and what that might mean for us in a real way. Joy, you love the Michigan Wolverines.
I do.
And this is now your official 2 minutes to gloat. Last time you were on here, we were here with Dave, and he gave you a little heck as a TCU Horned Frog because they did win last year.
Yeah.
But you love your Wolverines. And if anybody's followed you on social media, you went to the Rose Bowl and to the national championship game.
We got to back up before that.
Okay.
So 3-peat Big Ten championship.
Okay.
Winners. Yep, there we go. Then the Rose Bowl, beat Alabama in overtime. I was there. Tears were flowing as we won. Remarkable. Then to the national championship game in Houston. Traveled with my sister to both games. It was remarkable. Yeah. It was magical. It was everything that I could hope it to be and more. So yeah, it's our year.
But we love lots
Yeah,
of different things.
we do.
And you know, as Erin and Dustin are sitting there going, please, sweet Jesus, can we move on?
Let's keep
Our
going.
love of college football is
Yeah.
one of those things that drives, you know, fun, banter, and conversation and community in the midst of that. But as we begin this, it strikes me in this loving, just, free world God imagines for us that the order there matters, right? Love seems to be the foundation that makes justice possible, seems to be the foundation that makes freedom possible. And so if we don't manage to get love right, it's going to be a real struggle, right? What impediment, first let's begin with some kind of defining. What when we talk about love, what are we talking about? And then maybe what are some impediments, some things that get in the way of living out that love in community, for ourselves, and in the world around us. Erin, you wrote the book, right? As you think about love in this context, what are some beginning characteristics of what that looks like?
I'm really glad that you touched on the absolutely failure of the English language to really catch up with all of the meanings of things. And so that is one thing that we're just always going to have. That there's this limitation when we interpret scripture. Same thing. We run into the same limitations coming from the original language to English that doesn't translate exactly. But I think the idea of loving could be looked at as like, how do we have love in different scenarios? I wanted Joy to be here so we can talk about what it looked like in the congregation, in the church. What does it look like for love that way? But love is also a command from God that we have to love our neighbors, and our neighbor is really a complex term as well. But there's a command to love because it's really incredibly difficult to love all the time. Some people are also very difficult to love, and so there's so there's that command there, but it also starts with you have to love yourself as well, and so then there's that. So that's a different level of a different kind of love, a different like how self-love and care and compassion and grace for your own self. And then, of course, there's like the family relationships and just our friend relationships, the things that we have, and how do we express love and that. So it's not just one type of love that we're talking about when we're creating a loving world, but how do we embody it in all of those arenas?
Yeah. Well, I love that you named that as a command. That's one of the things we sometimes miss, right? Jesus doesn't give the love suggestion, right? Or the love good idea, right? It's the love command, right? Love God with everything you got and love your neighbor how? As yourself.
Yeah.
Lydia Waters, who once served when I was at Keller back in the day, she was our pastor to senior adults and retired African-American pastor who'd spent most of her time out in Compton. And one day we were sitting having one of those conversations that you have sometimes in church offices where you're like, where did that half day go, right? I was sitting in Lydia's office and we had just preached the great love command in what is largely a fairly comfortable, affluent, largely Caucasian context, right? And we were having a back and forth. And one of the things she said that has convicted the way I experience that scripture again and again, she said, you know, often in the comfortable church, you preach, love God and love neighbor, and stop there. But you forget the last two words, as yourself. Sometimes we got to spend as much time focused on how do we love ourselves, because if we fail to love ourselves well, right, regardless of our economic situation, regardless of our socio-economic situation, right, cultural situation, right, if we fail to love ourselves well, that's going to bleed over. And how are we able to love God and how are we able to love neighbor, right? If our inner critic, right, is the only voice we hear about ourselves, then that same inner critic's going to become an outer critic as we encounter our neighbors around us.
Right.
So,
and what makes it really complicated is we're also teaching that while we're also teaching humility.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of a tension with each other. And we're teaching it in a culture that we can't escape. We're all swimming in the same culture of messaging all the time that we're not enough, that there's something about me that's inadequate, which is why I need to buy new things in order to become better, right? And so we're in a culture that teaches us not to really love ourselves, to feel inadequate. And so it's very countercultural to start with, I'm gonna care for my own being. I'm gonna love me, and from that posture, then I can love other people.
that is a beautiful reminder, right? Then that tension, I love that tension, right? Because that is, I mean, we are beloved children of God, each and every one. We'll never look into the eyes of someone God doesn't claim and call beloved, right? And yet, and we are people of original blessing, right? If we look at Genesis, you know, before you get the fall, right? You have this moment of God created and called good, right? This is original blessing, but there's also brokenness in the midst of it, right? But I think that humility and that honesty help cultivate real love, right? When we are humble and honest on the blessing and the brokenness, we're able to love more fully and well in the midst of this. Joy, as you jump into this conversation, I wonder, where does love get messy, either in the church or in your own life? Where do things get hard, right? Erin does a fantastic job of inviting us again and again to the complexity and messiness of living love out in the midst of this study. Where have you found that to be difficult in the midst, or where does it just get messy, right?
Yeah, well.
And no need to name names.
Well, I think when we examine who is in our life, who we interact with, who we may interact with, we encounter people that are maybe difficult to love. We encounter people that have betrayed us, have, stabbed us in the back, if you will, that have, we thought we're in good relationship with, and you come to find out things later, and yet Jesus calls us to love our enemies. Jesus calls us through loving action to forgive not 7 times, but 77 times, right? Or 7 times 77. And that is love, right? And so how do we love those difficult people? And knowing that sometimes we are those difficult people.
Yeah. If you look around and can't find somebody difficult in your life, chances are you are the difficult person for somebody else.
Well, just ask my husband, right? I mean, sometimes it's hard, we're hard to love, especially after a long day. And so that's, I think, where we have to double down and dig deep. I often turn to 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind. If we are that noisy gong and that clanging cymbal, but we don't have love, we're nothing. We're not going to be heard. And so I think that's the messiness. That's that hard part where we have to really examine, how am I loving right now? Yeah. How are my actions loving? How are my words loving at this point? How are my priorities and the way I give my time, my energy, loving? Now, that doesn't mean to be walked all over, right? We have to have boundaries. Right. And I believe that boundaries are a part of love, right? I mean, we're not meant to be a doormat, right? Jesus says to when he sends out the disciples to go, 2 by 2, and if you're not welcome, shake off the dust and walk on. Right. Walk off. Keep going. And what I feel like he's saying in this point, like, go, show up, try to love. Yeah. But we know that sometimes not all that love is accepted, is welcomed. Right. And Jesus is not saying, beat down the door and just keep loving. Sometimes you got to move on, and maybe you got to circle back.
Sometimes we love best from a distance, right? Sure. There are some relationships that we just have to love best from a distance because of some inner toxicity or whatever. Brene Brown talks about how we have a soft front and a strong back, right? We're not meant to be run over, but we are meant to be clear, right, on where the boundaries are and, our worth, value, and ability to come to the...
And that's that self-love, right? Yeah. I love myself, that I'm going to have boundaries. And I'm also going to extend the forgiveness that maybe I feel like that person doesn't deserve, so that I can move forward with that same example for others to do likewise.
Well, I love that you named forgiveness as a connection there, because when we talk about acts of self-love, we think of forgiveness as like, Erin, you really offended me, or Joy, I offended you with your pseudo-Astros comment, or my pseudo-Astros comment, right? And we think, okay, forgiveness may need to come to this situation, right? And often we think of us forgiving somebody else as an act of love to them, right? But how often is forgiving an act of love to ourselves?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No, if you're in a space where you have to forgive someone, you have to do that for your own freedom, for your own release.
Yes.
Yes.
But it helps us when we're, even if that person has no idea that they've offended you or hurt you. Right. But when you're able to forgive and you're able to let go and release, my relationship with God, my love for God deepens. Yeah. My love for humanity, for the brokenness of this world, it deepens. There's a compassion, there's an empathy. That, I think, helps us to then go forward and love others, love ourselves, love God even more.
Well, and in that way, forgiving is not, I mean, there are times where we have relationships in our lives that are broken and things that go sideways that we're not able to find that restoration in this life, right? We lose someone either by geography or through death or whatever before we're able to bring that wholeness and restoration. But that does not mean that the possibility of forgiveness ceases in that moment, right?
Absolutely.
And the ability to kind of let go, right? And I love Hamilton's image of like forgiveness being the offloading the backpack of rocks, right? How we just keep tossing this weight on ourselves again and again, and how forgiveness is this finding freedom, right? These are all interconnected, right?
Yeah, it actually just strikes me how beautiful it is that this year, the way the Lenten season falls, so we have Valentine's Day on top of Ash Wednesday, and what a beautiful marriage of concepts. And when we're talking about the need for forgiveness and the need for remembering our own humanity and our own fallenness, that we can get naturally with repentance that comes with Ash Wednesday, but that goes hand in hand with love.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And I love that you loved that you saw that. And when you saw the calendar, I kind of went, because, none of my people, well, probably not none of my people. How many people are going to go to their fancy steak dinner with their loved one with a big cross on their forehead, right? So they're going to pick one of the two. I hope they don't. But, you never know. As we think about this, we've talked a lot about how it just in our general interpersonal lives, right? How do we love difficult people, right? I love Bob Goff's invitation in Everybody Always, right? To love difficult people 3 minutes at a time, right? So I'm going to love
the boundary.
You're really hard. I'm going to love you for 3 minutes, and then I'm out, right? And then ultimately in time it helps change things. Where does this meet the life of the local church for you guys, and where does it meet? Like, how do we love each other well? Not just the difficult people, but all the people, right? Joy, I know that part of what you're doing right now is really important and powerful work through caring congregations, and how do we help churches love each other well, right, and care for each other well in the midst of that? Where do you see this concept of love in this world God imagines for us intersecting with the life of the local church?
Well, I think when we think of love, right, one attribute of love, I would argue, is care. How do we care well for one another, for ourselves? Yeah. I mean, those have to, that two sides of the coin, right? But I invite us to think of this love or care holistically. When we love someone who is going through a difficult experience, maybe they just lost a loved one, the way that we love them through that grief, it has to be holistic. It can't just be listening to them or being concerned about their mental health and helping to connect with the therapist. It's got to be physical. It's got to be emotional. It has to be this spiritual care as well. And so when we think of care as this holistic process, it has so many different facets. And that's where we have to think beyond what traditional care is, traditional way that we love one another. We have different needs in different seasons, and that's going to shift, that's going to change, that's going to evolve. And we cannot assume that the way that I love you through the difficulties is the way that I would want to be loved. I would want to be cared for. Yeah. And so sometimes I think it's just asking the question, how can we love you? How can we care for you best at this time? Yeah. And not assume. And I think that's important. And that goes both inside the walls of the church and outside the walls of the church. We cannot assume that we are being this witness of love to the community if we're not knowing and being in relationship with those in the community of how can we love you? How can we care for you? Everyone's going to have different needs. Everyone's going to have different desires, and we don't know unless we're really in relationship with people.
That is powerful. And if you want a whole 30-minute conversation on that last piece, go back to Advent as the neighboring part of seeing, right?
Yes.
To be a good neighbor, to love well in our neighborhood and in our church begins with this invitation to see, to ask questions, to be curious, and to not assume I've got the answer that you need, right? The good Methodist casserole is the perfect answer for a lot of questions, but not every question, right? I remember, story time for just a second. At my mom's funeral, which we had last fall, one of her good friends, lifelong friend in Waco, got up to speak and told the story of the moment when she had just lost her mom. and mom had she had an extra key to her house, snuck into her house and left her a gift kind of sitting on the island there, and it was a bottle of Jack Daniels. Or Crown. I think it was Crown. It was Crown. Anyway, with a note attached that said, "For right now, I think you'd prefer this to the good old Methodist casserole," right? But it was grounded in their relationship, and no, we shouldn't be passing out Crown like crazy as a part of good active ministry. But in that relationship, it made sense, right? It was grounded in knowing and responding in that meaningful way. And Dustin may cut that from this episode. Who knows? But
when we look back to what is the greatest commandment, right? When Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he responds with that love is all about a relationship. And so we learn that love is not legalistic, it's relational. And so when we're grounded in that relationship of love, it seems to be so much more natural in the ways in which we can care well for one another. And that's, I think, what Jesus is all about, and teaching us and showing us and demonstrating what love really is.
And in the book that I wrote, this session on love is called Love Beyond the Surface. And that's super intentional because love is messy and it's in relationship. But I think that it's also probably worthwhile having a conversation like what love is not. And it's not just hearing sermons.
Right.
It's not, just when you said that story, I thought you were going with the problem is you just hear preaching about it and that's it. But sometimes that is the problem, right? That we come to a place like we can check off that we've gone to church and we've heard about loving. And this is with our mission/neighboring ministries that so often it is very superficial. Like I've collected things and here are your things, but I don't know anything about you. Right. I don't know your name.
I'm going to love you with our stuff, not with our heart.
Exactly.
And we give it away and we're like, okay, check that off. I've done a good job.
Right. Yes. We're amazing. Yep. We're so helpful and loving. Yes. But I think you have to have a relationship. And it's also not things like sending mass text messages out to people. How can I pray for you? Like that can be done in a way that's caring if it's in relationship. I don't say I'm not anti-text messaging.
Right.
But if it is just a mass message, it is not the same thing as caring. You have to know my name. I have to know who you are. Like it has to be deeper than just a superficial level of love.
And even in that kind of example, right? We know somebody's going through something really hard. We can post on their Facebook thing thoughts and prayers, right? Or we can pick up the phone and call them and pray with them, right? And those are very different things, especially if you got an existing relationship, right? You don't want to be the creepy random person calling and praying with people. But generally, if you're seeing it online, you're going to be in enough of a relationship to pick up the phone and call somebody. Right?
But love beyond the surface is following up in 2 months and at the year anniversary and at the 2-year anniversary and a 3-year and 5-year anniversary. I mean, when we love someone so deeply and we lose them, we don't forget the day they died. We don't forget their birthday. We don't forget that anniversary. And so love beyond the surface is taking it a step further to say, hey, it's been 2 years since your father's death. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you going through today? Yeah. How can I love you? How can I care for you right now?
I love the question, how can I hold space for you?
Yes. Yes. You're very good at that. Yes.
Yeah. And I think when I think about the vision statement that's really striking to me too is, when Bishop Sines talks about this vision, he talks often about the church 50 years from now.
Yes.
So even when the geriatric millennials have already retired, what does that church look like? And so we're talking about total transformation long-term on a big scale. So how can we move the conversation beyond the superficial things that we do now in order to create a world that is more loving? So there's a lot of, I don't know the answer.
Well,
it's a conversation though, but how do we start that conversation?
Well, and it's a fascinating one because, Erin, you named the Gen X cynicism that kind of inhabited you when you first encountered this. But that cynicism doesn't really dissipate generationally. And that cynicism in the emerging generations, right, the kids we are collectively raising, is getting turned toward institutions, right? And so if the church doesn't, in the church, we see it as more than an institution, but it is an institution to itself too. If it doesn't embody this new way of being, if it doesn't accept that full transformation, it's going to be judged with that same cynicism and deemed lacking, right?
Absolutely.
And there's such a mistrust as well. And so we are climbing this uphill battle, right? We're having this uphill battle of how do we restore that trust? How do we restore? When we love, it's not conditional.
Right.
When we love, what does that look like within the church walls? When we say everyone's welcome, what does that truly mean? When we say we love you, what does that truly mean? What does that look like? Like you said, how are we holding space for that love, even if it's different than my understanding of love or how I would love?
Well, and Joy, to circle back to where you took us earlier, right? There's an intentionality required to this. We're not gonna, wander our way into it, right? And whether it's on the individual level with how do I check in on somebody a year later or 2 years later, put that thing in your calendar,
Yes,
right?
I have to,
As somebody who,
that's how I do it.
I'm distractible enough to know that if I just leave it to my memory, the intention will be there.
Sure.
The execution may not be.
Yep.
So use the tools that you have to love intentionally well. And in many ways, this vision statement and the 5 priorities that come with it are the invitation of the church as a whole, right? The Big C church, to live into that kind of intention, to put action behind the heart so that we are good ancestors to those who come after us, right? So that the church 50 years from now, as our kids are nearing retirement, right? Think about that for a hot second, right? You talk about geriatric millennials being retired. Our oldest kids will be nearing retirement at that point, right?
Mine won't. Your youngest, my youngest,
right?
Yeah.
My oldest will be iffy. She's turning 13 tomorrow. But that world will be radically different, right? And with some intentionality, how much more transformation is possible in the midst of this. That's why this vision of dreaming a God-sized dream, not bound by kind of whatever constraint my imagination wants to put on it, right? I love that it's God's imagination in the midst of this. I hope and pray that we've sparked a little bit of what that loving world might look like for you. I hope we've sparked a little bit of what that loving world might look like for you. And we'd love for you to join in this conversation. If we've missed something on love, completely missed the boat altogether, or you just got a vision of what that world might be like, please share it with us, communicate with us, let us know, because I don't know about you, I'm excited for what that loving, just, and free world God imagines. I'll look forward to seeing little glimmers of it as we work our way into the future. And I'm thankful for the glimmers we've already seen in the faithfulness of God's people and the faithfulness of God's church that has brought us to this point, the folks who have been good ancestors to us along the way. Joy, thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry that your championship has an asterisk next to it, but
it doesn't.
I'm thankful that you're here. Erin, as always, thank you so much. And thank you for writing the book that invites us to this place, for overcoming that innate cynicism to give us a gift, to give your church a gift, and to give the people called followers of Jesus an invitation into this loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all. Amen. Until next time, I'm Daniel Hawkins, and this has been Pod Strangely Warm. This has been Pod Strangely Warm. If you enjoyed our conversation today, know that you can find us anywhere you find podcasts. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, any and all the places, we are there. So if you want to continue the good United Methodist conversation that you've been a part of today, find us, like us, rate us, review us, and share with a friend so that the good news that is happening right here in our own midst can amplify even